Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to introduce the Honorable Jane Harman, Ambassador Lamberto Zannier, Ambassador Daalder, and Karen DeYoung. Next week will mark the one-year anniversary of Russia's annexation of Crimea. As we reflect on these past 12 months, it is clear that the security landscape in Europe has changed dramatically, and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine is creating the conditions for what some analysts are calling a new Cold War. The path ahead is unclear. The ceasefire agreement signed between Russia, France, and Germany in February does not appear to have halted the fighting. Other nations in the region, including NATO members such as Poland and the Baltic states, feel increasingly wary of Russia. And there are growing calls from U.S. policymakers and security experts for the provision of lethal arms to the Ukraine. What are Putin's aims in this conflict? How would arming Ukraine alter the conflict, and what are the potential risks and benefits? And what are the wider implications of Russia's renewed military assertiveness for Euro-Atlantic security and military cooperation? This evening, we are very fortunate to have a panel of experts to discuss these developments. Now let me briefly introduce our distinguished guests. Congresswoman Jane Harman is the Director, President, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She's a former representative for California's 36th Congressional District, as well as a former member of the State Department Foreign Policy Board and Director of the National Intelligence's Senior Advisory Group. Ambassador Lamberto Zannier is the Secretary General for the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE. He is also the former UN Special Representative for Kosovo, as well as a former director of the OSCE's Conflict Prevention Center. Ivo Daalder is the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He is our former U.S. permanent representative to NATO, as well as a former senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he specialized in U.S. foreign policy, European security, and transatlantic relations. He is also a member of the Eminent Persons Panel at OSCE, where they look at the future of European security. And tonight's discussion will be moderated by Karen DeYoung, who is the associate editor of the Washington Post. Ms. DeYoung has also served as bureau chief for the Washington Post in Latin America and London, as well as a correspondent covering the White House, U.S. foreign policy, and the intelligence community. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. I can hear that this is working, yes? I think a good place to start tonight would be to have an overview of what is actually happening on the ground in Ukraine at the moment. We all know that there have been negotiations, ceasefires have worked, not worked. Fighting goes on even when supposedly there is a ceasefire. I just wanted to read to you a bit. The OSCE puts out a report pretty much every day of what their monitors. They have monitors in eastern Ukraine and also on the border between Russia and Ukraine, and they put out a report every day, and this is their most recent report, which says the security situation in Donbass is fluid and unpredictable, and the ceasefire does not hold everywhere, which doesn't tell us much, I think. There are examples there of where the monitors were refused passage into various areas where they wanted to look around, where escorts were not provided by one side or the other. They list long examples of incoming fire, outcoming fire, fire that they can't tell whether it's incoming or outgoing. The border observer mission that's been operating since last summer most recently said that on the 15th of March, 43 Russian vehicles entered Ukraine from Russia. As has happened in the past, they were inspected on the Russian side of the border by Russians, but not on the Ukrainian side of the border. They stayed in eastern Ukraine for most of the day and then left without anyone in the Ukrainian government ever actually looking at them. So I wanted to start by asking you, Mr. Ambassador, as the head of the OSCE, if you could tell us just a bit what the situation is on the ground. What is the status of the ceasefire? Is the Minsk agreement holding? Can you say that there's some progress being made?
I think you said it, fluid and unpredictable.
You guys.
All in all, if we look at the situation on the ground, we have a line of contact that is over 400 kilometers long. All in all, the ceasefire is holding, I have to say, along that line. We have two areas that are problematic. One is the Donetsk airport. And there we see still ongoing hostilities, and we're struggling to try to talking to local commanders to convince them to stand down. The other area is the south, the area around Mariupol. Also there is pressure, and there's pressure on both sides, actually. They're trying to pre-position themselves in a better way for whatever they might think might be the next phase, and that's the element of unpredictability. But all in all, compared with previous phases, and after these tragic events of the Debaltsevo, which followed, unfortunately, Minsk, and that was really something that got us very worried, we were trying to send our monitors to that area, to the Debaltsevo, to have better understanding of what was going on. And that's one of the places where we really stopped. We were blocked, and we couldn't really observe more closely what was going on there. This is one of the problems we have, these limitations on the ground, especially on but not exclusively on the separatist side, where very often we have the feeling that through escorts, etc., we are somehow guided, and we don't have the freedom of looking everywhere where we would like to see things. In terms of the withdrawal of heavy weapons, also there we had problems because we wanted to have baseline data, we wanted to have information on the itinerary, the timing of the withdrawal, information on the collection points so that we could also routinely verify. Nothing of this has happened on either side, I have to say. But then we have seen through our monitoring, and the OSCE is in a way the eyes of the international community in that region, we have seen these heavy weapons moving away from the front lines. So that is in itself an encouraging sign, but it's not enough, and we want to be more present. The third element, and a very sensitive one, is the border that you mentioned. We have lots of suspicion that too much kit is going through that border, and we would like to monitor it better. There we have a very limited access. We have a mission on the Russian side that covers only 2 crossing points out of 8, and we don't have authorization to patrol the border, so we have a static presence at those crossing points. So what you see is what we observe in that very limited portion of the border. And on the other side, on the Ukrainian side, where the Ukrainian border guards don't have access because it's all separatist-controlled area, we really struggle to reach the border. Episodically, we've done it a few times, but of course we've seen things over time. We've seen military equipment moving from a general direction that seemed to be that of the border, and so we are concerned at the fact that there is accumulation of heavy weapons. There is a potential for the conflict restarting. But all in all, the assessment is that after Minsk II, things have now calmed down. So we are in a phase where there is a good chance of further de-escalating the conflict and trying to create a space for progress at a political level.
Well, as we all know, President Obama is continuing to weigh a decision as to whether or not the United States should send what they call lethal defensive weapons into Ukraine. This is an issue that's been very divisive inside the administration as well as outside the administration. There have been a lot of calls for action. Congress has voted a bipartisan resolution calling on the president to do this. Ambassador Daalder, you were part of a very distinguished group who last month wrote a paper advocating that this be done. I wonder if, in light of what the ambassador has just described in terms of some improvement, would you want at this point to hold off on that? Or has the situation gone so far that you think that decision should have been made by the United States?
Well, my perspective is that we need to step back a little bit and remember what has happened in this 1 year period since early March of last year. We now know, because Vladimir Putin said so in a documentary that was shown on Russian TV, that The annexation with Crimea was not something done because there was a referendum of Russian-speaking people who said, we want to be part of Russia, but it was a deliberate ploy by the Russian government, led by Vladimir Putin from the very beginning, designed to make sure that Crimea would become part of Russia. What we are talking about when we are talking about the ceasefire and the withdrawal of heavy weapons in the border that Ambassador Zannier just talked about, we're talking about the presence of foreign military elements in a country that has not invited them. That's normally known as an invasion. But for some reason, diplomatically, we call this something else. But the reality is that what is happening in eastern Ukraine is the presence of a foreign military power, directly and indirectly, with troops and military equipment, occupying a part of the country that is not theirs. They're already occupying Crimea, but they're also doing the same in the Donbass region. So the question that confronts all of us, and I think confronts the US government and confronts the European governments, is how do we respond to something like that? My view would be that at the very minimum, we should respond to that by giving the country that is being invaded the capacity to defend itself. Self-defense is a pretty fundamental right under the UN Charter. We are dealing with a country whose military has been absolutely devastated over 25 years of terrible mismanagement, and providing them with the kinds of capabilities that we advocated. We're talking about UAVs to find out what's going on behind the battle line, counter-battery radar so you can see where the artillery and the rockets are coming from, secure communications, because right now the Ukrainians are talking to each other over open cell phone lines that are easily listened into by the Russians and the separatist forces who have Russian capability. Humvees to provide the capacity to transport troops from one part to another, and yes, anti-armor missiles, the kind of Javelin anti-tank missiles that allows a soldier in the Ukrainian army to deal with the armor that is coming across the border. And the administration recently agreed to provide all of that equipment in what I would regard too small a quantity, except for these anti-tank missiles. Because it is recognizing that the right of self-defense is a pretty fundamental right of states. And I think if you look at it in that frame, and you say we're not trying to give the Ukrainians the capacity to defeat, let alone invade Russia, but to defend its own territory, then it seems to me reasonable that even while things are better today than they were 4 or 5 weeks ago, that even today providing for some capacity of self-defense is not a bad idea.
But I think you're right. The administration did last week announce that it was going to send more communications equipment, more of this radar that will allow them to determine where firing is coming from with greater accuracy, a lot of vehicles, but not the so-called lethal weapons. And I guess my question is, Ukraine is Europe, at least.
Yep.
Yes.
Last I looked.
Our principal allies in Europe don't want this to happen. They don't want us to send lethal weapons. Congress has, one of the few bipartisan things they've done recently is to vote this resolution and really sort of demand, and it's become, the Speaker of the House last week was very dismissive of the president in terms of saying that he was once again showing weakness in the face of, in this case, a threat from Russia. I want to ask you, Congresswoman Harman, is this a place where the United States should be adopting a policy that our European allies do not agree with? And I'll take your point, which I'm sure you will make, that some of the Europeans do, but our principal allies. And is this something that Congress really should be involved in?
Well, first, let me say how happy I am to be out of Washington.
Always welcome.
The entertainment capital of the world. And as you heard from the introduction, I'm a recovering politician. It's not a 12-step program. I did spend 9 terms in the United States Congress, and much of that time served on the Intelligence Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, and the Armed Services Committee, focused on those issues. But I am very happy to have spent the last 4 years heading the Wilson Center, which is a slightly bigger version of the Chicago Council. And we worked very closely together. I was thrilled when Ivo joined here as your president. He's a good friend, and we collaborate on many programs, including this one. Our little signage is directly in front of me. And this is a follow-on to a program we held yesterday in Washington with the OSCE. It's the first ever Security Day, which is a Lamberto Zannier creation of days that he holds in Vienna, Austria. That's where the OSCE is based. I mean, it's a hardship to live in Vienna, Austria. We all know that. And he has days to discuss the tough challenges that the OSCE faces. So we persuaded him to take the show on the road. He came to Washington yesterday, and we got a lot of attention with our conversation about Ukraine and about Afghanistan and about terrorism, 3 different panels. But we had the Russian ambassador and the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. sitting next to each other and fidgeting and making very different statements. And then we had the U.S. The expert from the National Security Council there, and we had the 4th one was the German ambassador to the OSCE. Germany will be the chairman of the OSCE next year. Serbia is the chair this year. I know there's a huge Serbian population here. And last year it was Switzerland, and the year before it was Ukraine, go figure. But the OSCE, my third shout out is to the OSCE, which is a very unique regional security organization, which has 57 members, including Ukraine and Russia. So it's positioned in a way, and the United States, that none other is. Finally, got to say something about the Smith Club of Chicago. How did I know they would take over half of the place? And the most intelligent people in this room are sitting over there, just so you know. Okay, so to answer your question, Karen, it's complicated. You know, Congress operates in press releases. It's very easy to say the president should do this, especially if you're in the other party and you want to embarrass the president. Certainly most people in Congress, and I'm one of those people not in Congress, think we should have we should assert America's role in the world. We should not shrink back and retreat behind our borders, which, as we all learned on 9/11, are not invincible. On the other hand, figuring out what the right thing to do in Ukraine, at least to me, and I was not part of Ivo's snappy study group, and he is more credentialed than I am to look at this specific question. But figuring out what the right thing to do is hard because of our allies in Europe. Yes, some of them want us to provide these arms, including Petro Poroshenko, who's the president of Ukraine. But some other countries in Europe also want this. The president of Lithuania is one of them. She was on a panel with him and me in Munich a couple months ago, and she said this. But others, one of which is Germany, or at least the leaders of Germany, there probably are people in Germany who disagree, don't want us to do this and feel that the sanctions which we have imposed jointly on Russia because of its improper, illegal behavior are a better tool to cause Russia to change its behavior. You have to assess whether, in asymmetric terms, our strength is our economy against Russia's, or our strength is providing limited weapons against a Russian army which is right next door. And I'm not arguing against the proposition, Ivo, but I think it's very tricky. And a final point, the Wilson Center has a very big institute that studies Russia called the Kennan Institute. We have had 1,400 scholars in the region. We have some in Ukraine. We have a small office in Kyiv. And those people are very cautious about this, and add one other element which we haven't mentioned, which is that the Ukrainian army is not particularly capable. And if we give them these things, it's not that most of them seem like no-brainers, but if we give them the defensive lethal weapons, will they be able to hold them, or will they somehow get into the wrong hands the way they have unfortunately done in Libya, and if you read today's paper, in Yemen. So that is another worry.
I want to switch the conversation to Russia, and I think that, and I invite any of you to respond. There are two basic narratives about what's happening. One is that this is the beginning of World War III, that Russian expansionism is a direct challenge to NATO, and that really this is a challenge to the entire post-Cold War, certainly post-World War II, but post-Cold War infrastructure that has kept the world more or less peaceful in big power terms. That the United Nations is, the way it's currently configured, is powerless to do anything about this because of the Russian veto, and so it's become a useless organization in this sense. That the OSCE, because it doesn't have enforcement capabilities on its own, really does not have the wherewithal to enforce its own mandate. That NATO itself operates by consensus, and there is none. That therefore, sorry NATO, that therefore the United States really does need to move into a leadership role and kind of take this and move with it and impose an order on it. The other narrative is that the United States and its European partners have misunderstood Russia from the start. That they very blithely went in and threw out some bait to Ukraine without thinking through what this was going to mean to the Russian perspective. That for Russia, this was proof of their greater of what they're dissatisfied with in the post-Cold War world and the international order. That Ukraine leaning toward Europe directly threatens their future, and it certainly threatens Vladimir Putin's idea of what the world was going to look like with a kind of Eurasian power center that would be on one side and Europe and the United States on the other side. So I want to get you to talk a little bit about this, whether it's immaterial that Vladimir Putin's feelings are being hurt and that he's struck back in this way, and that the United States, with whatever allies want to come along with it, really does need to exert force, or whether over the long term, as many have argued, that this basically makes Putin stronger by confronting him, rather than allowing what seems to be a sort of inevitable collapse of this system that really cannot support itself, and under sanctions and under just the attractiveness of the West versus what's going on in Russia, that if we just have strategic patience, it will fall apart, and that we shouldn't confront him now because that actually gins him up and gins up his support. So who would like to respond?
Do you want me to
Sure.
start with a few considerations? First of all, what we see today in Russia shouldn't surprise anybody. We have seen, and we've had in the OSCE, for instance, for now decades, examples of what we call frozen conflicts, whether it's Transnistria or Georgia. We see these days Russia concluding an agreement with South Ossetia that goes in the direction of a progressive integration, if you want, of South Ossetia or in the direction of the Russian Federation. Russia doesn't seem to feel comfortable in its post-Cold War skin, in a way. And this in two ways. One is sort of in its own space, in its own former Soviet, so that has to do with the relationship between Russia and the other post-Russian countries. And hence also this strongly Russian-driven process of integration with a number of tools from the CIS to the Eurasian Union to the CSTO, the collective treaty security treaty organization, all very strongly promoted by Russia, that tries to or seems to try to want to reconsolidate a little bit that space. But the second aspect is the relationship between Russia and the European and Euro-Atlantic institutions. perhaps in the debate that those institutions had internally, the Russian factor was not present enough in a way, or was underestimated in a way. And over time, Russia started resenting that. The mechanisms that they had to engage were not entirely satisfactory. But the NRC, Ivo will have his own views, he saw it in action. But I heard myself from the Russians a kind of a dissatisfaction on the effectiveness of these mechanisms. But the Russians are also hiding behind these arguments the fact that they themselves never showed a real interest in engaging proactively with the and opening up a discussion. They tried a few initiatives in the OSCE, but in a very formalistic manner, proposing a security treaty for Europe, etc. A proposal that keeps resurfacing, and it's also in the background of these processes that are ongoing, one of which Ivo is a part, this panel of eminent persons, that will have to relook a little bit at the security setup as we have in Europe, and is this satisfactory, etc. So. I think it is important to try to understand where Russia is coming from and the problems that Russia is seeing in its own post-Cold War skin, as I say. But then we need also to focus more closely on what is happening now and the aspect that you were mentioning, and the internal weaknesses of Russia, and the fact that conflict and fueling nationalistic movements is strengthening the Russian leadership in this moment. So that's something we need to take into account, and when we point to certain individuals, I think we shouldn't forget also what the dynamics are, for instance, in the parliament, which is very interesting to follow. And we see, we have a parliamentary assembly in the OSCE where we see a pretty loud Russian delegation whenever they come, really putting forward lines very, very actively and very aggressively. At the last meeting, they came and they brought a Crimean parliamentarian. And that was seen largely a very, very provocative gesture, but it's a kind of a robust approach that we keep witnessing, and I think it's important also to take that into account.
Ivo,
well, I think there are these two views, no doubt, and I think Lamberto is right that there may be, and there are some legitimate grievances on the part of the Russians with regard to how the post-Cold War period has evolved. And there are ways in which those issues can be resolved through dialogue and discussion. And like Lamberto, I have sat in many meetings, not as many as you have, because Russia, of course, is not a member of NATO, but they're a member of the NATO-Russia Council. I've sat through those meetings, and I've heard the complaints. And then when you ask, so what would you like us to do? The answer really is, well, we'd like you to go away. We just think that NATO should have been disbanded. And we really don't think that the European Union should be reaching out to its neighbors. And just go away. That's basically the answer. Then you have to look at not just what they're saying, but what they're doing. And in that regard, there's a trend here that is deeply worrying. You have the old conflicts in Transnistria, Nagorno-Karabakh, and of course Georgia. You now have the new one with regard to Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. And then you have these things like, let's no longer even pretend to be part of the Conventional Forces in Europe treaty, the most important treaty that ended the Cold War, signed in Paris in 1990, which Russia has not complied with since 2007, and has now said, forget about it. The second most important treaty that ended the Cold War was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement that banned, first time under Ronald Reagan's leadership, together with Mikhail Gorbachev, banned an entire class of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. and they have, the U.S. government has said, violated some pretty central parts of that agreement. They, today, are exercising major military forces by putting nuclear-armed missiles in Kaliningrad. I mean, it may not be a return to the Cold War, because I don't think it is. The Cold War had a particular characteristic of ideological confrontation. But this is the kind of behavior we haven't seen in decades. Nuclear bombers flying down the channel, as, oh, by the way, flying down the east coast of the United States and practicing nuclear missile strikes on Norfolk, which happened in October of last year. This is serious stuff. Again, I don't think we're in for a military confrontation, but it seems to me a little bit of an overreaction to whatever humiliation or problem the Russians are conceiving. And the lack of dialogue, and Jane, we were there in Munich, where Foreign Minister Lavrov, you were there, gave a speech and did questions and answers that were astounding in all practical, in terms of what it is that Russia was wanting, where he compared the Crimea situation favorably to the unification of Germany, because the unification of Germany there was no referendum, whereas there was one in Crimea. And on and on. This one, by the way, got a good laugh from the German audience at the time. And you just sort of wonder, what world are you living in? And it was, I believe, Chancellor Merkel who told President Obama early on in this conflict that this man lives in another world. By the way, I don't know where he was, in which other world he was in the 12 days he was gone. But anyway, and so you do have to ask the question: what is it that we do in opposition? And it seems to me, no, we don't go for his bait. We don't go and arm everything and everywhere and stand up and seek a confrontation. But we have to be serious. We have to be serious about our defense. We have to be serious about what NATO stands for and the defense of territory. And we have to be serious about the rules of the road, one of which is you don't change borders with the use of force. And when that happens, there are consequences. And those consequences, I think, should be economic and political, not military. So sanctions are a great idea. The economy will fall. I think the idea that we are going to have the World Cup, the most important sporting event in the world, in Russia in 2018, under these circumstances, those are the things I would do, while at the same time being very clear that when it comes to the territory of NATO, in that case, there is a distinction between being a part of NATO and not a NATO, we will defend ourselves. But we're dealing with a country that is becoming increasingly unpredictable and is doing things that are dangerous. And we can't ignore it and say, oh, these poor Russians, if only we were nicer, things would be okay. And by the way, I don't think any government is doing that. I think there's a large degree of unity today in NATO, in Europe, on what we need to do. There may be a division about whether to provide arms, but in the larger context, I think you have a very united US, European, Canadian view about what it is that we need to do, and that's a good thing.
Well, I wonder, Jane, just following up on that point, if this whole discussion has gotten skewed in some way because of the arms question, certainly politically in this country, that's it, because in certain quarters in Washington, they're looking out for ways to push their own narrative on the president's foreign policy. And if somehow it seems like the be-all and end-all of any discussion on Ukraine now has become, why aren't we arming these poor defenseless people?
Yeah. Well, I don't think anyone is arguing that there is a military solution to Ukraine. The issue about defensive lethal weapons has to do with, if they are provided, will that put us in a better position to negotiate a political outcome in Ukraine? I'm looking at everybody around here. We all agree on that. But I would just add a couple of other things to the pot. Last year was the 100th anniversary of World War I. Woodrow Wilson was then president. He went into his re-election saying, no, he hadn't been re-elected yet. He said, the U.S. will never enter the war. Of course we did. And looking back on it, most people think there was a series of miscalculations. Depends on which country you think started it and all the rest of it. But looking back on it, it was an accidental war. It had incredible consequences. I think highest number of deaths in any war, et cetera, enormous cost in other ways too. I worry about World War III with all this saber rattling by Russia. The danger of miscalculation again, and various countries being brought into something, including Russia, that no one intended. So, I mean, we really have to worry about this. Second point is this issue of grievances. Well, I don't know how to psychoanalyze Vladimir Putin, but if you do roll back the videotape, I guess there isn't a videotape anymore, but if you go back to the end of the Cold War and the steps that were taken afterward, you can see perhaps why Russia felt it was a great power and felt humiliated. And then we, the US and others, formed various organizations and then expanded them, leaving Russia out. And this contributed to grievance. I'm not making the case for this, but I remember that George Kennan, then alive, said it was a mistake to do NATO expansion. Many people in the US government, especially, I remember this well because she's a good friend of mine and probably yours, Madeleine Albright, was strongly for it and helped drive it through in the Clinton administration. She, of course, was born in the Czech Republic and lived this experience and very much wanted a bigger NATO. But at any rate, if you look back on it, you can see how this grievance was fed. And then when a Russian stooge fled Ukraine, possibly Putin panicked and claimed it was this coup by the United States, which it, of course, wasn't. And so you play all that out and you understand perhaps his mindset. But I want to add one more thing to that. Russia doesn't just play in Ukraine and Europe. Russia plays now, especially in Syria, Iran, and other places where I know the Obama administration believes, and I believe it too, we can and should be working with Russia toward goals that we share. And I can see a way forward, if you put all these pieces together, where Russia, which did play a positive role on helping rid Syria of most chemical weapons. Understand there's still chlorine there, and at least according to today's reports, the Bashar government is using chlorine against its own people. It's just shameful and horrifying. But at any rate, Russia played a positive role there. It could play a positive role there. On Iran, Russia is very central, it seems to me, to supporting or helping forge and supporting the right deal with Iran. I don't know that that happens, but Russia could be very helpful there. So there are ways that we could, and I think we're trying to do this, pull Russia back into a world order which would perhaps feed Russia's need to be viewed as a good world citizen. And that doesn't excuse anything that's happened in Ukraine, but just maybe working in these other arenas, we can find the key to working out the political solution in Ukraine. And that my final comment is, that's why some people worry that providing these defensive lethal weapons, instead of getting us more on the right path, could get us into the wrong path and feed this possibility of miscalculation.
Well, and moving into, Eva, what you said about, we basically need an economic solution, a diplomatic solution. You know, the Ukrainian finance minister has been in Washington this week, basically pleading for money. The Ukraine economy is close to collapse, and I think the sort of general thinking is if it does collapse or if it doesn't improve, that they're not going to be able to deliver in what is a deeply divided society, even without the Russians and without Eastern Ukraine even. They're not going to be able to deliver in a way that allows that government to survive and prosper and to be not only a partner to us, but to stand up to the Russians. The IMF has said that they need $40 billion over the next 4 years in order to just pay their debts, many of which are owed to Russia. which is not likely to give them the kind of debt forgiveness that perhaps they're looking for. The IMF has promised $17.5 billion. The United States has promised $2 billion. The Europeans have promised $2 billion. And together that comes up to just slightly more than half of what the IMF itself and certainly the Ukrainian government says that it needs. What's the solution to that? Does that government need to show more? Do we need to just say, we know they're not perfect, but this is how important this is now that they physically survive, economically survive, and just push that money through?
I think as both you and Jane said, the debate about arming has overtaken our entire policy towards this region and towards Ukraine, which is unfortunate. And if I contributed to it, I still believe that we did it right. And we're still right to making the argument that's not where we wanted to go. I mean, clearly, the solution, the only solution, and in fact the necessary solution, is a viable Ukrainian state. And that viable Ukrainian state for now has some chunks that are no longer under the control of the government. Ultimately, they need to come back under the control of the government. But at least those chunks, which happens to be the vast majority of the country and the population that is under Ukrainian and Kiev government control, needs to succeed. And in fact, the only way to defeat the Russians is for that part to succeed. So the IMF decision, which was a very courageous and important decision by the IMF just a few days ago, to provide this loan guarantee of $17.5 billion in order to underscore the $40 billion that is necessary, is critical. And the finance minister, who, by the way, is a Chicagoan, who knows about this more than anybody else, together with the rest of the government, has taken extraordinary steps in the last few months to pass laws that are necessary to finally get the kinds of economic reforms that are necessary for Ukraine to succeed, cutting energy subsidies and a whole host of things that one would have hoped that had happened a long time ago, were central to the success of countries like Poland and others in Central and Eastern Europe. And we need to find a way for this new Ukraine, as George Soros calls it, to succeed. And if it succeeds, we, the Ukrainian people, and we who stand with the Ukrainian people, which I think is all of us, will have won. And by the way, Russia will have lost. Because the one thing that Russia wants to do, what this is about, is to control Ukraine. It's about the control of Ukraine. They'd like to do it cheaply. They'd like to do it without invading the country, but it's about the control of Ukraine. Ukraine cannot become cannot be a successful economy, democratic country that looks west rather than east. That's what this is about. It's a very big geopolitical game. And the way to succeed is for the people in Ukraine to succeed. They made a choice, a pretty big one, a year ago at Maidan. Cost hundreds of them their lives. We've had elections. They've been quite remarkable, with Mr. Poroshenko winning and then the parliamentary elections. And now you have a government that's willing to reform, and we need to help them. So let's disagree over whether or not to send a bunch of Javelin missiles, but let's agree about the importance of providing Ukraine with the economic assistance that it needs to succeed.
But could I add a PS to that? Because Ivo didn't mention it. I know he's aware of it. But the riots at Maidan were driven by the fact that the people there, mostly young people, were sick and tired of the endemic corruption in Ukraine. You know, think oligarchs, one of whom, by the way, was Tymoshenko, a woman who had led the country and who was jailed by the then president, got out of jail. She was trying to come back as one of the presidential candidates. She lost badly to Poroshenko because people felt she was still part of the whole corruption story. But it's not just reducing subsidies and so forth. It's changing the whole ethic there by government officials who have skimmed off a lot of the revenues in the country. And what's tricky about that is that a lot of the people who were in the Rada, which is the parliament, I mean, there were new elections, but I think it's still true, bought their seats. I mean, you could say that about the U.S. Congress too, but not exactly that way. And a lot of the oligarchs who've provided some security and support for the government. Guess why they're oligarchs? And by the way, Poroshenko's an oligarch. He had a big chocolate fortune. So making sure that that changes is a very hard move politically. But if it doesn't change, then the aid that's going into the country, which should go, I totally support the IMF loan and our billions and all the rest of it, isn't going to work.
Yep. No, I couldn't, I fully agree, and I think you have a chance now because you have a set of leaders that is willing to try to tackle these deep-seated problems. They need to succeed. If they fail, even though, then the cost will be on them, and it shouldn't be on us. But we need to help them succeed, and the finance minister's one, and there are many people now who are trying to address this, and corruption is truly endemic. It's almost as bad as it is in Russia.
We want to open the floor now to your questions, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to my colleague here.
And first, may we please have a round of applause for our distinguished panel this evening. Two brief things I omitted in the opening. If you are interested in the content from this evening, our distinguished fellow Dick Longworth is doing a summary of this evening's event. That'll be available on our website tomorrow. We're also live streaming, so the video will also be available. So we'll now go out for your questions. If you can please raise your hand, wait for the mic, and please do keep your questions to a question. Well, maybe while our audience is formulating a question, I'll ask the first one here. How important is Mr. Putin himself to this whole scenario? Is this a resurgent Russia in some ways just retaking its spot on the global stage, or how much can we attribute to Mr. Putin himself?
Well, I'll give a go. I mean, this panel is as shy as the audience, apparently, which is the first time I've been at a Chicago Council event. But I'm sure that will change. I mean, I think Putin is pretty central to. I think he embodies much of what Lamberto was talking about earlier when it comes to the Russian views of humiliation, in the sense that we need to reassert itself as a great Russian power. But it would be a mistake to think that if only Putin were gone, things would be going back to normal. Most of the analysts of Russia today think that the chances of Putin being deposed wouldn't be by liberals, but it would be by people who are even worse than he is. This is a society that is now run by about 135 people who own most of the wealth. Mr. Putin is one of them, but you can remove him, and there are a whole bunch of others who are more than happy to steal the country blind, as they have for the last 25 years. And they are, in some ways, far more nationalistic. Putin seems to me, is not a great strategist. He's much more a tactician. He uses nationalism as a means to an end. But as Jane said, I mean, if you look at what they're doing on Iran, that is pretty darn pragmatic. They don't want an Iran having nuclear weapons any more than we do. And if we're going to get an agreement, the key to that agreement, which nobody is talking about, it's not inspections, it's not what it's 10 years, it's not how many centrifuges there are. The key to that agreement is Russians' willingness to take an Iranian agreement to take fissile material produced by the centrifuges and send it to Russia. Because if there's no material in Iran, you can't build a bomb. And Russia is the key to this. And so far, by all indications, they're playing, they're a part of that. So that suggests that there is still a leadership that is willing to engage pragmatically on issues that matter. And there are a whole bunch of leaders in Russia who wouldn't be willing to do that because, quote, it would be helping the United States or something like that. So it could get worse, which is hard to believe.
Yes, okay, we'll take our first question just up here in the front. And forgive me, Ambassador, Congresswoman, did you want to add anything to that before? Okay, sir.
In dealing with terrorist organizations and other extremist groups through the 20th and into the 21st century, it's often been said that it's necessary to engage with their ideas. Communism, Nazism, that a failure to engage with Nazism was a big mistake, to just dismiss it. Would it not be advisable to engage intellectually with this odd world that Putin is inhabiting, but which is having consequences? Would it not be, for propaganda purposes, if nothing else, or psy warfare, to understand where he's coming from and engage it so as to neutralize it?
In fact, I think we are trying to do that, and we are successful, obviously, to a certain point. Depending on the areas, what we see, for instance, in the OSCE is that we have different segments of the agenda of the organization. In some areas, there is full cooperation in fighting against terrorism, fighting global challenges, and the Russians are part of the policy of the organization, and they're a driving force in some areas. But obviously, when you come, and now geopolitics is back, as we are saying, and when we come to that kind of issues, the engagement becomes more difficult. But of course, and to come back to the earlier question, to make progress, or to try to make progress on issues such as Ukraine, we need in this phase to engage and to find leaders who engage with the Kremlin and with Putin himself, and try to understand also where he's going and where what are the elements that are needed for a deal. In the background, there is an effort to try also to systematize this. One of the problems we have is that as we are witnessing an atmosphere that reminds us of the Cold War in different ways, and with all including the fact that in some areas there is engagement, and even a positive one in a certain way. But we have a system, a security structure that is in a way what we had during the Cold War itself, that hasn't been updated enough. And sometimes we feel that the tools that we have are not adequate enough. What we're doing in the OSCE, sometimes we're improvising a little bit. We are developing new mechanisms based on what we have. But some of the old things, arms control has been mentioned. We are losing one after the other the arms control tools that ensure stability in the last 25 years after the end of the Cold War, and also in the last phase of the Cold War. And nothing is really replacing them, and that is of concern. And often the Russians tell us, well, you come up with proposals, you suggest what you want. And that's where we ourselves, as international community, but also the various clusters of countries, of like-minded countries, let's call it this way, within the international community, are not focused enough on some of these issues. So we need now to relaunch this dialogue and try to engage Russia. Of course, this is one of the paths. The other path is that if there is no response, and we see then the other direction, which is the sanctions and the penalties for the violation of the principles that we all agreed. And in the case of Ukraine, we have seen very open and very clear violations of fundamental principles that govern our relations. And that's where also we find, how can I say, differences in the international community on how to handle these massive violations. The whole debate on weapons on Ukraine is based on the premise that Ukraine was relying on the fact that it had security guarantees that had been given to it in return for its own denuclearization in the early 90s. And those security guarantees were openly violated by one of the countries who had offered them to Ukraine. And of course, now this is opening up the issue of, Ukraine is not equipped now to deal with the kind of security challenge that he has at his own doorstep.
Yeah, I would just add to that we are engaging Russia in other parts of the world where we have a much more positive relationship. We've been talking about Syria and Iran, and Russia could really be, if the reprocessed fuel goes to Russia, an offer Russia made years ago, a huge part of the solution on Iran. So there is a conversation there. It's a little harder to have it in Ukraine or about Ukraine. We heard the frozen version yesterday. I mean, the statement of facts by the Ukrainian ambassador and the Russian ambassador were completely different. That is why one of the keys, I think, is this overhead architecture, surveillance equipment to show what's happening on the ground. And that's not just something the U.S. can provide to Ukraine, it's something the OSCE is working on doing, and the OSCE is viewed as a much more neutral player than the U.S. is. Problem that Lamberto has is money, but if he had more money, they would either purchase commercial imagery, which is very good, or do something. We had this conversation yesterday, to show a picture of what's happening. When you're looking down, these drones flying around or whatever it might be are vulnerable. Satellites are less vulnerable. But then you can show whether tanks and other things are coming across the border or going back across the border, and whether little green men, I wonder if they're little green women. I don't hope not.
Yes,
Certainly
yes.
they don't go to Smith, are going across the border. But what that forces you to have is an agreed upon set of facts. And then it's much harder for these alternative realities to be played out.
On that note, would any of our guests from Smith like to ask a question this evening? Okay, next question, please. Yes, how about the gentleman on the side over there in the dark jacket?
Hi, Josh Raisin, University of Chicago Booth School of Business. One of the ideas that's been battered around for tightening sanctions is barring Russia from the SWIFT payment system. Do you think that would be beneficial? And if so, what are the knock-on effects for global financial integration, and whether it may push countries like China to develop their own separate system?
My view is that it's a threat that is out there, and clearly the ability of Russia to access credit markets has already been significantly.
You might explain what SWIFT is.
You do that.
It's
You're the one
cur-
who created the mechanism
I
to
did.
do this.
I personally did this. Yeah, it's the currency of international banking. If you shut them off from that, you shut down their banks.
But they, I mean, in many ways, they are already shut out of most of the financial banking system. And you don't actually have to shut them out of the SWIFT in order to shut them out of getting access to particularly Western credit.
A real symbolic.
But symbolically,
step.
it will be
A great
important.
ratcheting up
So,
of sanctions.
you know, I think we need to be very clear that if there is a next step on the military side, there has to be a next response. So right now, the Minsk agreement, imperfect as it is, it's kind of sitting there, and the ability to get everybody to agree on the next stage of sanctions under these circumstances isn't there. But the one area where I think people are most concerned about, the one area where there is this repositioning and some fighting, is down in the south in Mariupol. Mariupol is a very major port. It is the second largest steel factory in Ukraine that is under control still of Ukraine. And if the city were to fall, the field would be open to a land bridge some 250 kilometers further down the line, but a land bridge to Crimea. So it's a pretty significant strategic area. If there were fighting that led to the fall of Mariupol, I think we have seen an escalation that is strategically significant and has to have a strategically significant response. SWIFT could be one of them. Barring all visas to all families, not just the oligarchs, the heads, but the entire families. So their kids couldn't study at Harvard or, God forbid, at Smith, or
This is getting personal.
well, I don't know if you want them at that point. To go to their $135 million condos in the Dashas in London and New York.
In the south of France, yeah.
That would hurt.
It might hurt those economies too.
Well,
I mean, real estate prices are high in these places because there's so many Russians.
well, maybe maybe Americans could finally buy a house in New York then, as a result. So.
Okay. But there's one other point there. Do we want the Russian economy to collapse? No, we don't. I think we don't. We want a message to be sent that's very effective. But Henry Kissinger, for one, will tell you that, you know, the collapse of this massive country, bigger, I think, landmass than any other country on the planet, which includes also terror groups and all kinds of folks, would wreak havoc in the world of a geopolitical nature that would be beyond anything we are currently talking about. And so, no, we don't want the economy to totally collapse. We want sanctions to be a political tool to send a message to change Russian behavior, not to implode Russia.
Great. Next question, please. Yes, the woman right down here in the front, please. Oh, wait for the mic, please.
If you think about Russia wanting to resurrect the Soviet Union, Putin might be dreaming about that. How do you see Putin threatening the Balkans? And where is NATO going to be preemptive if something like that happens? Stoltenberg and NATO, what is their role for the Balkan states? That must feel a little vulnerable given Ukraine.
Thank you.
Everybody's looking at me for some reason. I mean, I think clearly the Baltic states feel
The
the leaders.
Baltics or the Balkans?
The Baltics,
Oh, the
yes.
Baltics.
The Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Clearly, these three countries, which were part of the Soviet Union, and now are part of NATO, the only three, feel exposed and vulnerable in a way that wasn't the case prior to this, although they were never very comfortable. When you live in Latvia or Estonia, when 25 or 30% of your population is Russian-speaking, and the president of Russia has just declared that it is the right of Moscow to defend Russian-speaking people wherever they live, including Brighton Beach, by the way. At least, so watch out. You get worried. That said, I think the administration and the other allies of NATO have stood up from day one to send a very clear message that whatever may be happening in Ukraine, for that matter in Georgia, or other places that are not part of NATO, is one thing. But NATO, which includes these three Baltic states, is quite another thing. And the response was immediate when the crisis erupted a year ago, when the United States, Germany, many other countries started to send aircraft to do air policing in much larger numbers than had happened before. Exercises that are taking place. There's one happening right now, today. 6,000 NATO troops on Baltic territory doing exercises to demonstrate that NATO is prepared and ready to defend this territory. And I often get asked, how real? I think, having spent 4 years looking at this from a great vantage point, I think this is about as credible a commitment as there is. If the Russians were to succeed in attacking successfully a NATO country, even one that has only joined NATO 11 years ago, that would be a calamity for all of NATO countries. And it's something that I think Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister David Cameron and Prime Minister Harper and Prime Minister Renzi and President Hollande and President Obama understand extraordinarily well, which is why this has been a focal point ever since this crisis has happened, to make sure that there is a capacity for the defense of these countries. We now have 6 NATO command flags in Eastern Europe, 3 in the Baltic states, 1 in Hungary, 1 in Romania, 1 in Bulgaria, and 1 in Poland. If you had asked me when I was still at NATO until July of 2013 that the NATO would have a command flag in any of these countries, I would have told you were crazy. There was no way that anybody would have agreed to it. We just did it last February because of what the Russians did. This is, by the way, what the Russians did. These actions have strengthened NATO, have weakened the economy of Russia, and strengthened Ukrainian nationalism It's not exactly what you would have in mind if you are worried about a strong NATO, a strong Ukraine, and a weak Russian economy. But those three things are just happened because of as a consequence of these actions.
Well, yeah, but many people think of NATO as a two-tier alliance. The U.S. provides most of the muscle and most of the money. And some astute observers like David Ignatius, writing in Karen's newspaper today, question, what was that phrase he used?
Whether NATO still had the muscle memory of deterrence. The
muscle
memory
of deterrence
had atrophy.
And question whether, notwithstanding the exercises and the flags and the statements by leaders, and Ivo's not wrong about any of that, it really would invoke Article 5 to defend the Baltics. I think that's what you're asking. And would the American public, let's just talk about that, be enthusiastic about our being a huge part of a NATO mission to defend Estonia, Lithuania, or Latvia? I'm not saying it wouldn't, but I think at least there's a question mark there.
But isn't there are ways to destabilize those countries beyond a direct military confrontation, and you see the Russians now with a huge propaganda effort. They've got radio, they've got online stuff, they've got, trying to rile up the Russian speakers, and that there are ways to pose a threat beyond or apart from actually attacking there.
If I can, on this point, we have seen the impact of that in eastern Ukraine. When we first deployed the first monitors, and this was before even the green men came through, we engaged with the population, and this might even be covered in some of the initial reports from the SMM early last year. And we saw that the large majority of the population were refusing to take a position in this debate. There were debates, and there was a sense that Kiev was away. There was a power vacuum because the party of region had disappeared somehow, and people were confused. But there wasn't the animosity that we saw appearing in later phases. After the green men appeared, they took control of the transmission hubs. They closed down the Ukrainian networks, and then only Russian channels started operating and being received in the region. And we saw over time how this affected the people. But beyond that, as I travel through the OSCE area, for instance, some Central Asian countries, what I'm hearing is that people, and including different, how can I say, sectors of the population. Young people tend to work more on internet and more open to international media. Older people tend to rely on often Russian channels. This is creating tensions within the societies. The way the Ukrainian problem is understood is creating debates and divisions inside the population, including among ethnic groups in these countries. And this may become also a source of conflicts on which we are focusing because we are worried at seeing these trends. Yes, the polarizing narrative of the media is certainly a factor of conflict.
That is a huge deal. And I was an election observer in Ukraine last May as part of the National Democratic Institute delegation led by Madeleine Albright. The International Republican Institute also had a delegation, and OSCE was all over the place with roundtables and groups. It probably was the most important force in generating the turnout that happened, which was considerable. But on the television, almost everything, all the information about the election came from a station called Russia 1. There was no other effective station with political news that people in Western Ukraine, we were in Kyiv, could watch.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that is all we have time for this evening. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel. A special thanks to our co-sponsors this evening, the Wilson Center and OSCE. Thank you all so much for attending, and good night.